good morning, or the other way around, actually, I think. The title of my presentation today is The National Rural Development, the Role of the National Rural Network in Ireland. And for my presentation, I'm going to kind of set the context, first of all, in relation to rural development and some of the changes and trends in relation to defining and exploring rural development. And then I'm going to continue on to look at European rural development before I look very briefly at Irish rural development policy. Before I touch on what the National Rural Network does, I'm going to look at the European Network for Rural Development and how this pans out and focuses in on a much more national basis. As Monique has already introduced me, I am a rural geography lecturer at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and my key area of research and lecturing is in rural geography. And at the moment, my main work would be on as lead researcher on the National Rural Network project in relation to several other projects that we have ongoing. So possibly just to set the context to this presentation, and in looking at rural development, as many of us will know, rural development is an area of research that has changed considerably in recent years. Excuse me. And I suppose in some ways we've moved along from a modernization paradigm that was very much a top-down basis for rural development. And more recent trends in rural development make us look towards what we call the new rural development paradigm. Now, this paradigm focuses very much on places and small local places in rural areas, much more than the sectors that develop or that govern those areas. And there's also very much more an emphasis on investment in local development, bottom-up local development, much more so than subsidies and subsidies being given to rural areas. So in an era of what we can see as reduced agricultural employment right throughout many developed countries, the new rural development paradigm, it emphasizes bottom-up endogenous rural development. So development that takes place and takes part and includes people from within local communities, from within local areas, much more so than development that is pressurized or insistent from a top-down approach. Now, in realizing or bringing this new rural development paradigm to the fore, several policy environmental changes were necessary. And I suppose in some ways we can see the rural development paradigm taking place when you look at how the policy has shifted or changed accordingly. So what we now have is a much more strategic investment as far as policy is concerned. And this strategic investment takes place or emphasizes bottom-up rural development. And in many respects, it supports local enterprise. So what we now see is enterprise in local areas being supported by funding coming from rural development. We then see sectorial or sectoral changes that have shifted from sectoral changes much more so now to territorial policy. So you have policies that emphasize the advantages that are already there within rural areas and how to cater for those rural areas and cater for the development of local enterprise. We also see an increase in partnerships in local areas, partnershipping with local development, partnershipping with local development NGOs, and partnershipping with local government. We see a decentralization also of policy administration. So we do not have policy coming from central government anymore. We have much more localized policy taking place. So this strategic investment enhances this new rural development paradigm and realizes this shift that we now see in rural development. This rural policy in the EU and in Ireland, it very much reflects the new rural development paradigm. So in some ways, the paradigm shift and the rural policy is a cyclical kind of emotion. So when you have changes within the rural, you see this shift, this new rural development paradigm materializes. And in turn, you see rural policy changing accordingly. New rural policy within the EU and within Ireland aims very much to foster competitiveness within agriculture. It also is there to ensure the sustainable management of natural resources and climate action, which is a key part of European and Irish rural policy at this stage. Rural policy within the EU also tries to achieve a balanced territorial development of rural economies and communities, so that we ensure that all rural communities gain an advantage in trying to develop their community. And in many respects, it sees how we can create and maintain employment within rural areas, including peripheral rural areas, which has seen a huge decline in population and decline in employment in recent years. A lot of rural policy within a European context is materialized through what we call a common agricultural policy within the EU. Now, this is a common set of objectives, you could call them principles or rules, right throughout the European Union. And these coordinate or they support European agriculture. And in many respects, this materializes through what we call two pillars of policy within rural areas. And the first pillar that we see here deals very much with direct payments to farmers and market measures to ensure that farmers get a fair price for their produce. So that's very much part of the Common Agricultural Policy of Pillar 1. So you would get income support for food production or income support for environmental functions that the farming community take care of in today's world. In Pillar 2, this covers much more the rural development measures. And within this area or within this pillar, this includes those that are beneficial for environment and also for climate change. So we also see within the second pillar, rural development policies that enable public goods for different types of communities or community groups within rural areas. Now, in looking at Pillar 2 specifically, the broader rural development policy objectives, these are then further articulated through 6 priority areas, which provide a basis for implementing policy. So the Common Agricultural Policy and Pillar 2, this is different priorities. And the first one of these policies or priorities is how we transfer knowledge and innovation, which has become a huge part of rural development in recent years. This idea that it is very important that what information or what knowledge we gain in one area should be transferred, and innovative practices should be transferred as knowledge transfer. So other areas or other community groups or other individuals within farming or within rural development could benefit from this knowledge. Priority 2 is very much around farm viability and competitiveness. And again, ensuring that we have a viable and competitive farm scenario for our farming community within the EU and within Ireland. The third priority here looks at food chain organisation and risk management. So again, this is where funding would materialise right through down through the community to the rural communities and the agricultural communities as far as food production is concerned. Priority 4 looks at restoring, preserving and enhancing ecosystems, which has become a huge part of EU rural development policy and in turn Irish rural policy. Priority 5 looks at resource efficiency and climate resilient economies. So again, a huge aspect of EU rural policy at the moment is looking at climate resilient economy and ensuring that we protect the climate and ensure that rural and agricultural communities have policies dedicated to climate resilient economy. Priority 6 is very much in and around social inclusion and economic development within rural areas. Social inclusion in particular, looking at aspects of including all people within rural communities. And I suppose in recent times within developing countries, we have seen a decline in the agricultural community. So this priority focuses very much on making sure that all people who live within rural areas are included within the economic development of that particular rural area. So I suppose when we look at rural development programs within the European and within the Irish context, within this framework of rural development policy, we see how every member state within the US or within the EU, they have to implement a rural development program. And the Rural Development Programme is a document that is drawn up in different countries or in regions, and it sets out a strategic approach and an action to meet the needs of the specific geographical area that they cover. Now, within the Irish context, we have one Rural Development Programme. However, within other countries, we'll say France, for example, they may have several regional development programs that are specific to the geographical area that they cover. So at the moment, we're in a phase of the 2014-2020 programming period. And within this programming period, right throughout the European Union, we have 118 national and regional rural development programs that are funded through what we call the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. And this in turn is often matched by national contributions that materialize or that try and execute the rural development program within each country or in turn within each region. For 2014-2020, there's approximately 100 billion European funding coming through the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and 61 billion of public funding in each or in member states collectively. And all of this money is currently being used or being spent to fund rural development right throughout the EU. If we take this rural development programme, and I suppose at the moment, if we focus a little bit on rural development within the Irish context, we can see how Ireland has also drawn up a strategic rural development programme for the period 2014-2020. And the EU in turn will support the rural development programme within the Irish context. And it supports the Irish programme through the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, which averages out at about 313 million euros annually, or an aggregate sum of 2.19 billion over the 7-year lifespan of the rural development programme. Now, our rural development programme within Ireland is also supplemented by our Exchequer funding, which comes through our Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. In looking specifically at our rural development programme within Ireland, in many respects it reflects the EU rural development policy that I outlined and the 6 priority areas that I outlined previously. But specifically within Ireland, we have measures that look at knowledge transfer. So specifically transferring good practices, good knowledge that we have gained or explored or looked at within an Irish context. Our second measure looks at advisory services. So we have extension advisory services within Ireland that try and assist the farming community and the rural development community in exploring rural development actions or exploring better production agricultural aspects of agriculture. So funding within our rural development programme also allows for investment in physical assets. It also allows for rural services and the renewal of rural services within an Irish context. Another measure within the Rural Development Programme in Ireland allows for agri-environmental climate and specific actions that improve agri-environmental climate issues as well. There's a specific measure within the Rural Development Programme that also looks at organic farming specifically, and it tries to enhance or increase the involvement that we have in organic farming within the Irish context. Our Rural Development Programme in Ireland also looks at areas facing natural constraint, and it provides funding for those areas that are facing this natural constraint. Our Rural Development Programme also funds cooperation projects throughout the EU, and particularly in relation to our LEADER programme, which I can talk a little bit about in a few moments. Cooperation within LEADER programmes or within LEADER companies right throughout the European Union. So I suppose those are specific measures within our Rural Development Programme over the next 7 years in Ireland that are specifically reflective of the 6 priorities for the European Rural Programme and European Rural Development Programme. How does the European Network for Rural Development fit into the policy environment? Well, the European Network for Rural Development is an exchange hub for information on rural development, policy, programs, projects, and other initiatives, and how these are working in practice and can be improved to achieve much, much more than they are already. So the European Network for Rural Development is a project group that has been set up by the European Commission to specifically exchange any type of information right throughout every country within the EU that have rural development programs and practices in situ at this current time. The European Network for Rural Development, it aims to engage and reach anybody that's interested or committed to rural development in Ireland at the current time. So they would have key stakeholders that would include the national rural networks, which I'll talk about extensively in a few moments. They would also include the Rural Development Programme Managing Authority and paying agencies throughout every country within the EU. They'd also include local action groups, European organisations, agricultural advisory services, agricultural and rural researchers, and any other interested rural development organisations or individuals right throughout the EU and indeed within the Irish context. The European Network for Rural Development has key objectives that they follow in all programmes, and these are to increase the involvement of stakeholders in rural development, to improve the quality of the rural development programmes in every country throughout Europe, and to inform on the benefits of the rural development policy, what kind of advantages that policy have had within the European context, and learn from that so other nations could improve from different good practices throughout the EU. The European Network for Rural Development also support the evaluation of rural development programs in all 118 programs, which is key again to ensure that we have excellent programs coming through over the next number of years. The European Network then, one of the stakeholders of the European Network are the national rural networks. And in many countries or many member states, national rural networks have been set up in order to support or enhance rural development programs and rural development objectives as they are outlined within the programs in different regions or in different countries. So the national rural networks, in many respects, they enable and facilitate all of the exchanges and the learning between all the partners involved in rural development policy implementations, the public authorities, economic and social partners, and the relevant bodies representing civil society. So it is the job of the national rural networks to work at a national level to ensure that there are positive exchanges between anybody involved in rural development policy and anybody involved in rural development practice. Within an Irish context, in late 2015, the tender materialised for running the national rural network within an Irish context. And I suppose this is where we in NUI Galway fit into the equation here at this stage. So the National Rural Network is contracted here in Ireland by the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, but it's funded by the department, but it's also funded by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and EU structural funds. Having tendered successfully for the National Rural Network in Ireland, NUI Galway paired with the Irish Rural Link, which is the lead partner for the National Rural Network here in Ireland. They also paired with another group called the Wheel, which are an umbrella body for voluntary organisations in Ireland. And they also paired with Philip Farley and Company, who's a consultancy group who is focusing very much on the agricultural element of the National Rural Network. Now, in some ways, those four groupings that have come together are called the National Support Unit. And the National Support Unit are the implementing body of the National Rural Network. So the National Rural Network and the National Support Unit, they support the members or the membership of the National Rural Network. And they are there in many respects to facilitate the flow of information that comes directly from the National Rural Development Programme. The key aims of the National Rural Network within an Irish context are to maximise the beneficial outcomes of the Rural Development Programme for this programming period. The National Rural Network also aims to increase the involvement of stakeholders in the implementation of rural development within an Irish context. The network is also there to improve the quality of the Rural Development Programme right throughout the programming period, and at the end of the programming period to ensure that the next Rural Development Programme learns from any mistakes or indeed from any benefits that have come from the current programme. The National Rural Network also aims to inform the broader public and potential beneficiaries on rural development policies and any opportunities or funding opportunities that come through the Rural Development Programme. The network also aims to foster innovations that occur in agriculture, in food production, in forestry, and indeed in rural areas. Now, in achieving those aims, in achieving the aims of the National Rural Network, when the National Support Unit set itself up, they divided the programme into 9 different work packages. And for the rest of my presentation, I'd like to go through those work packages to see how and to show you how the National Rural Network delivers this programme as such. So the work packages consist of the network management, good practices or best practices, EU networking, biodiversity and environmental challenges, climate change in the farming community, viability and competitiveness of the farming community, the LEADER programme, the LIFE programme, and EIP Agri, which is European Innovation Partnerships for Agricultural Productivity and Sustainability. So what I'd like to do now is just go through each of these work packages, which will give you a flavour of what the National Rural Network is all about. So the National Support Unit in the first work package, the network management, within this work package, really this is the management and governing of the National Rural Network. And this package really is just to establish and support the network. And we do this through developing newsletters, creating events and developing events, and other programs and projects, which are part of the management and communication strategy for the National Rural Network. So the network management really includes the communications, the website, as well as managing any kind of risk management or compliance or reporting. Work Package 2, which in many respects is central to the National Rural Network, and it's central to that idea of disseminating knowledge or disseminating any type of innovation that has occurred as far as the Rural Development Programme is concerned. So this work package It collates and disseminates examples of good practice projects or case studies right throughout all priorities of the Rural Development Programme. So all of the different priorities that the Rural Development Programme engages in, it is up to the National Rural Network to seek out any good practices that arise or any case studies that should be disseminated so other people can learn from these case studies and in turn replicate their success. It also helps in identifying and analysing transferable good practices for any type of practices that we've seen that other people could partake in. And to date, we have done that in the National Rural Network. Over the last year, we've disseminated a considerable amount of good practices or case studies for the general public or the National Rural Network membership to examine, explore, and hopefully to replicate. Our third work package revolves around EU networking. And within this work package, we work with the European Network for Rural Development to ensure that we disseminate work that is going on within the Irish Rural Development Programme, and to ensure that Irish case studies or good practices are disseminated right throughout Europe. So it's the network's job to ensure that we're not just disseminating Irish good practices to Irish people, but we're also disseminating it right across the EU and the member states. As far as EU networking is concerned, the National Irish and National Rural Network is also involved in engaging in rural development policy development and evaluation. So it's also part of our job to ensure that we examine the Rural Development Programme and in turn we evaluate it as we go along to ensure that it is successful and we learn from issues that arise from it. To date, Ireland have become hugely involved in the European Network for Rural Development, getting involved in different events that have occurred, getting involved in developing different type of workshops within the within the European context. And very recently, we were involved in developing a workshop on social hubs in rural Europe, looking specifically at women in rural areas and in rural development. The Irish National Rural Network and Support Unit are also involved in the European Assembly for Rural Networks, which again is allowing us to voice our opinion and to disseminate Irish case studies and good practice within the European context. Our fourth work package within the National Rural Network looks at biodiversity and environmental challenges. And within this work package, we, within the National Support Unit, hope to identify and disseminate again any good practices related to the policy on farm practices which promote and enhance biodiversity. We're there to promote any competitive advantages through biodiversity practice that we see on the ground, and that we can promote and combine biodiversity and enhance production methodologies that other European countries or other people within Ireland could learn from and indeed could replicate. Our fifth work package for the National Rural Network revolves around climate change for the farming community. And this work package ensures that we increase awareness both at farm and extension advisory level of the issues and complexities in and around climate change. So again, for this Rural Development Programme 2014-2020, it contains a huge variety of initiatives ranging from organic farming, knowledge transfer, and advisory upskilling, which target actions aimed at reducing the impact of agriculture on climate change. So the National Rural Network will promote any initiatives and try and collate and disseminate good practices in and around climate change for the farming community. And again, we have done that on several occasions, right throughout our website, throughout our NRN newsletter, and throughout our e-bulletin, looking and focusing at good practices that allow us to ensure or to reduce the impact of agriculture on climate change. Our sixth work package revolves around the viability and competitiveness of the farming community and the broader rural community. So the National Rural Network, it highlights the challenges and the good practice and smart practice models that can support the farming community to remain viable and competitive, which is increasingly difficult for many small to medium farm community farm families within the Irish context. Within this rural development, or within this work package, we have focused on a certain amount of areas, and we've focused on succession and inheritance, which is a considerable issue within farm families within an Irish context. We've also focused on women in rural and in farming and rural business. And we've looked very much at innovative practices of women within farming and within rural business. As far as viability and competitiveness is concerned, we've also tried to highlight organic farming and give it priority from the outset, particularly as organic farming is something that our rural development programme within Ireland is trying to focus on and in trying to enhance. Additional matters of concern as they arise in the Rural Development Programme will also be taken into consideration by the National Rural Network if it can in any way enhance viability and competitiveness within rural areas or within the farming community. Work Package 6 focuses very much on what we call the LEADER programme within Ireland and within the EU. Now, the LEADER programme is very much run and disseminated by the local action groups within the Irish context. Now, the LEADER programme is a programme that has been running within the EU and within Ireland for over 20 years. Now, it's a programme which funds bottom-up rural development. It's a programme which allows for financing of any type of innovative practices, any type of community development initiatives, or any type of individual initiatives. So key priorities are set out within the Rural Development Programme, and communities or individuals can in turn apply for funding to enhance their rural area or possibly create or develop an enterprise or development initiative for individuals or indeed for communities. So the National Rural Network, looking towards the local action groups, they play a key role in the implementation of the Rural Development Programme. And as such, the National Rural Network is giving key consideration to the LEADER programme within its policy or within its programme initiatives. So the National Rural Network will provide capacity building and training for local action groups who deliver the LEADER programme. The National Rural Network also tries to carry out regular needs assessments to ascertain the type of training that the local action groups require to make sure that they deliver the LEADER programme to the best of their ability. The National Rural Network will also encourage local action groups to become more active members of the National Rural Network, where they can participate in selection process for prioritising any key thematic areas of the Rural Development Programme that impact them most. Our Work Package 8 is the LIFE programme. And the LIFE programme again is part of the Rural Development Programme within an Irish and within a European context. So the LIFE programme co-funds projects in Ireland which are there for the protection and improvement of nature and the environment. So the National Rural Network then, it will examine and explore the dissemination of good practice models of the LIFE programme within Ireland. And one LIFE programme which has been hugely successful in the past within an Irish context has been the Burn LIFE programme. And at the moment, we also have the Arran LIFE programme and many other programmes, including the Kerry LIFE programme, which enhances and improves nature and environment within an Irish context. So the National Rural Network will look at these programmes and they will identify areas of practical collaboration, how the LIFE programme informs locally led schemes, and how people can learn from areas of nature and environmental enhancement and improvement through the LIFE programme. One of the last work packages that we have is a work package in and around European innovation partnerships for agriculture. Now, EIPs, for short, European Innovation Partnerships, is very much a new programme and policy development for the European Union and in turn for Ireland. So European innovation partnerships will provide money for a multi-actor approach within rural areas. So what it looks for the farming community, it looks for the advisory community, it looks for the research community to come together to look at an issue or a problem that they could attempt to solve as a collective group coming together. So the action plan for the National Rural Network will try and bring these groups together. They'll try and connect within the regions, within the country, and they'll try and connect existing networks and try and bring together advisors or researchers or farmers and incentivize them to look at innovative projects. Once these projects are up and running, the National Rural Network will then in turn look at disseminating these projects so other people can learn from the problems or the issues that have been sorted through these European innovation partnerships. The National Rural Network will in turn collaborate with the European Network for Rural Development and EIP Agri by participating at EU meetings and exchanges at an EU level and providing examples of projects that have been successful within an Irish context, so some good practices and information for networking statistics. This project has only taken place or has only started up within the last 6 months within an Irish context, and calls have already been put out trying to set up European innovation partnerships or operational groups within the Irish context. And these will be rolled out within the coming months within an Irish context. To assist the National Rural Network and the National Support Unit, the advisory subcommittees have been set up or have been established to devise or to assist in devising an action plan for the National Rural Network, which in some way ensures that all relevant areas of the rural development programme are explored and in turn are disseminated. These advisory subcommittees are there to direct and to guide the National Rural Network and the National Support Unit, and to ensure that all areas of the rural development programme are explored and in turn disseminated. So in some ways, if I can conclude, the National Rural Network, and I suppose for NUI Galway, is a new area of research for us within the university. And it's a new area of research in that it allows us to connect directly with the policy environment. It allows us to connect directly with those that initiate, those that develop, and those that implement policy. So I suppose for us as rural researchers, it gives us a huge window of opportunity, not only to work at the cold face of rural development and the cold face of policy implementation, but it also allows us to look at work that is directly carried out on the ground, work that is funded by the Rural Development Programme, and the work that we can disseminate not only within other rural communities and rural groups, but also within our own rural research environment. So in conclusion, Ireland's National Rural Network, it's facilitating all the actors, all the stakeholders, any of the beneficiaries or interested groups in the achievement of better outcomes across the entire suite of measures under the Rural Development Programme that we have at this current time, 2014-2020. And in doing so, if I revert back to what I started with, the new rural development paradigm, if you look at the National Rural Network and how it carries out its work, and how it tries to implement the policy of the National Rural Development Programme, it, in many respects, it realises this new rural development paradigm that we see within an Irish and within an EU context. And it ensures that we have a new rural development paradigm that supports bottom-up endogenous development. So I suppose in conclusion, that's just has given you a snippet of the National Rural Network within an Irish context and how it relates to both the policy environment and the new rural development paradigm. So thank you very much for listening to me. And if there are any questions that have materialized at this stage, I'd be only too delighted to help in answering anything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farrell. As outlined before, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. So far, we don't have any questions. I just want to thank you all for joining in. And if any questions come, as I outlined, please feel free to let Dr. Farrell know, and she will be happy to answer them, I'm sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. I suppose just to say as well, Monique, that we have a website that people can log on to just in relation to the National Rural Network, but also in relation to any of the work that we do within the National University of Ireland in Galway and some of our research there. So if anybody wants additional information, or if anybody even wants to join the National Rural Network in Ireland, you can log on to www.nationalruralnetwork.ie and you will be sent a e-bulletin or a newsletter which will update you continuously on any of the policies or even on any of the case studies that the National Rural Network explore, research and disseminate.
And thank you so much, Dr. Farrell. And also, if you would like, we could submit that URL on the YouTube video. So when they're watching it, if they scroll down and look into description, they can see your URL and they can be directed right when they're watching this video if they choose to do so.
Perfect. That would be excellent. Thank you very much.
We have a question here from Dr. Ray Bowman. And his question, he wants to ask you, at the end of your talk, you mentioned research at Galway, at University in Galway. What are you doing regarding your research? And he would like to know.
Yes. I suppose at the moment we have several different projects ongoing in addition to the National Rural Network, which I suppose it's a little bit of a department from what we normally do. It's much more working at a policy environment, and out of that we have developed several different projects. Particularly at the moment we're looking at this, what I spoke about earlier, this European Innovation Partnerships. So at the moment, we're developing a project in and around the European Innovation Partnerships and looking how these multi-actor approaches, how the groupings that come together to create the European Innovation Partners, how these partners work together to answer issues or problems in relation to the environment. As far as my work in in Galway is concerned, I also am involved in an EU project at the moment, a Framework 7 project called the Imagine project, which looks at spatial diversity and also looks at migration and how migration and uneven migration occurs within different areas, particularly looking at how uneven or spatial migration occurs within rural areas for rural return migrants and for migrants moving in and out of rural areas. I would also have work ongoing at the moment in relation to succession and inheritance, particularly in relation to farm families and how difficult it is, particularly within an Irish context, for succession and inheritance to occur within the farming community, and for farming communities and farm families to hand over farms to younger farm families at the moment, or younger farm individuals. So this would be just some of the work that we have ongoing. We'd also be considerably involved with rural development within an Irish context as well.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell. I hope your extensive explanation answered his question. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them in the question and answer box. So far, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Farrell, for providing us with this informative webinar.